Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this Centre for Social Justice webinar, where we are asking, do we need a new vision to support the victims of modern slavery? I'm Joe Shalam, I'm Policy Director at the CSJ, and I have the great pleasure of chairing this webinar this afternoon. This is the first in a new series of webinars that we'll be running at the CSJ, and so if you like this, please do look out for more of these sorts of events in the future. I'd like first of all to say a huge thank you to our fantastic panel for being with us and who I'll introduce very shortly, but also to all of you for tuning in. And I can see more people coming in now as I speak, which is great. So I think it's fair to say that the deeply troubling scenes emerging from Ukraine at the moment are causing lots of us, and certainly myself, to consider just how fragile the freedoms are that we enjoy. But the fact is, and we really can't forget this, is that there are people today in this country whose freedoms have been completely eroded and whose lives are turned upside down by the evil of modern slavery. We know with some confidence that there are at least 100,000 people in modern slavery in the UK today, and beyond the human depravity of the crime, which is designed to turn people into profit, it's also costing the UK economy itself billions of pounds. But there is cause for hope. We have a proud legacy of addressing modern slavery in Britain, including the first Modern Slavery Act of its kind internationally, which was passed in 2015. And so, again, it's great to be joined by this excellent panel to talk about how we can better support victims and actually address this crime in the context that we find ourselves in today. So I'm going to introduce our panel now. First of all, an extremely warm welcome to Carolyn Harris. Carolyn is the Labour MP for Swansea East and has been since 2015. And on top of being, I'd say, one of the country's very best campaigning MPs on issues as varied as gambling to menopause, Carolyn is also formerly Shadow Minister for Women and Equalities and previously Shadow Home Office Minister, responsible for modern slavery policy. So Carolyn, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us. We're also delighted to be joined by Cristina Huddleston, who is Director of European Operations at the anti-slavery charity Justice and Care. Cristina oversees the charity's frontline work in the UK and Romania, including the award-winning Victim Navigator project. And before Justice and Care, Cristina was the Anti-Slavery Partnership Coordinator across Essex and Kent Police, with her work resulting in more than 600 victims of modern slavery being identified across the two counties. So thank you for all of your work, Cristina, on the front lines and for being with us. And last, but certainly not least, welcome to Louise Gleich. This is the CSJ's very own acting head of modern slavery. Louise has been working in modern slavery policy for nearly a decade, I'm sure she'll forgive me for saying, and never fails to amaze me, frankly, with her expertise and downright commitment to real change in this area. And we'll hear more from her shortly on our recent research. But now a reminder to you, our audience. You have a key role to play in this debate. We want the discussion to be as interactive as possible. And so please do enter your questions in the Q&A box below our floating heads. We've been Zooming for some time now, so presumably this should be easy enough to do, but we'd love to see and hear your questions this afternoon. And so without further delay, I'm going to hand over now to Louise to talk through the revelations of the report published by the CSJ and Justice and Care just a week or so ago. So Louise, over to you.
Thanks, Joe. And of course, it's I'm the head of the joint policy unit with Justice and Care as well. So Justice and Care can claim me as their own as the CSJ, and it's great. It's great to be here with everybody today. So as Joe said, we published the report a month ago. I had a shock today when I realised it was March, and a month had already passed since we published the report. And the report really came out of some research we did a couple of years ago. It still happens here, which looked more broadly at the spectrum of modern slavery and what's happening at the moment in this country. And one of the things we identified there was the whole issue of victim support and actually whether it is up to the task at hand in terms of whether we're meeting the needs of the victims that we're currently seeing come into the system and the ones who aren't, and actually whether we're helping people on the journey towards recovery. So we did this piece of work over the past year. And what we really wanted to look at was that whole stage of the journey that a victim takes from that first moment that they're identified. How are we supporting people at that point? How are we meeting their needs as they come through the support system? And are we setting people up for recovery? And what we found really is that there is some good work being done by some people, but actually there's a lot of gaps in the system. And there's a lot of places where we need to improve. And actually, the good work we spotted is particularly where people are filling some of those gaps. So issues around particularly fear, that we know is such a big barrier for individual survivors, even engaging with the police or an offer of support at the beginning. And we need to do much more to support people at that first moment that they come into contact with someone that can help them, to build their trust, to give them a bit more time to understand what support is available to them, what their options are, how the police system works, all of that kind of thing, to build a relationship and help them feel able to engage with support. Because when we do, then we know that we're able to help them on a path to recovery. At the moment, we know that too many victims are being identified, but for whatever reason are not entering support, and then they're potentially at risk of further exploitation because they don't get the help that they need. And then looking at the whole question of how we support people that do come into the system that we have, that concept of needs-based care. And unfortunately, what we found is that actually, although we have good language around needs-based care, at the moment, eligibility tends to trump need. In so many cases, victims have to go through lots of checklists or lots of hoops, or there's all sorts of barriers to them being able to access the kind of support they need. And partly this is because we're finding actually a lot of victims have very complex needs. So the range of support they need varies. And so they need access to lots of different kinds of services. And so if you have to qualify, if you like, for those services, that's actually becoming a barrier for people having the support that they need. The other thing we found in terms of needs-based care is that we're sort of focusing too much on this process and bureaucracy, and we're not looking enough at the outcome for the victim. The survivor themselves actually is what we're providing them, helping them make a journey towards recovery and protecting them for the future. Or are we focusing on just what we're giving them now? Not enough being done by the system to look at that whole kind of journey and where we're hoping to bring people to at the end of the needs that we provide to them. That's not to say that the people supporting individual victims don't care. They do care, and we spoke to lots of individual support workers who are caring and looking to that. But the way the system is set up doesn't have that as its primary goal. We also looked at one of the things that keeps people in a limbo in terms of their recovery, which is the decision making and the delays that we have with the system that the Home Office uses, the national referral mechanism, to formally identify and recognise and confirm that someone has been a victim of modern slavery. And what we found is that delays of around an average of 500 days at the moment, over a year of people waiting to find out if they've been formally confirmed as a victim. And that situation of it could be any day now I get my decision, means that people's recovery actually either stalls or often even takes a dip as they just have to wait to find out whether the Home Office will confirm that they've been made a victim. So we need to do a lot more. The Home Office needs to do a lot more to streamline that process, to find out why it's taking so long, to put things in place to help speed up the process. And the final area that we looked at is this whole question of how we can help the criminal justice process and the support system work better together, because actually both of them are there to do good for the individual survivor. The criminal justice process is there to help that victim get justice and also to protect other people from being abused by those same exploiters. It's also the support system's job to help victims make their recovery. And often they might need the police's help to do that, to keep victims safe. So what we found is that there are some places where people are working in partnership really well. And actually the Justice and Care Victim Navigator Programme is one of those examples. There are other examples of good partnership working between police forces and charities and involved in the support system. But there's also areas where there are gaps in the system, either through lack of working together, lack of understanding about the role that each has to play, or sometimes a lack of trust, which I think tends to come from a lack of understanding of the roles that each has to play. So we think that there needs to be a much better collaboration and partnership working between police forces and the charities, and also local authorities and so on, to have a rounded approach to individuals. Because that way, then we can try and help people move from a place of crisis into a place where they're better able to make good decisions about their future, and hopefully have a future that is safe and independent.
Thanks so much, Louise, for that overview. Incredibly helpful, and lots to reflect on. I'm sure our audience is reflecting on those points as well, and we're thinking of questions too. Carolyn, you see these reports come and go from think tanks. We know how useful and how important they can be. I probably would say that, wouldn't I? But turning report into change is a different question. And it'd be great to hear from you sort of what you see as the main challenges in this area, and also some of the potential opportunities to seeing that new vision for victim support.
Thanks, Joe. First of all, like anything that Justice in Care and the CSJ produce, this is excellent stuff. I mean, I am a big admirer of the work that both these organisations do, and never underestimate the power of a report, especially good reports, because it does change hearts and minds. I'm quite an emotional person, and all my campaign and all my politics is I am a Labour politician, but my politics is really about making sure that this place and me as an individual have a platform, and that we can use that platform to make life better for other people. And this is what we're talking about. We're talking about people. We're talking about human beings here. We're talking about a bureaucratic system that is stopping human beings from having respect and dignity. That's the worst kind of depravity I can imagine. Can you picture seeing a child being sexually abused and turning a blind eye, knowing it was going on? Because that is what modern slavery is. It is something so immoral, so unbelievably dreadful, that you cannot comprehend exactly how dangerous that is. And I get really frustrated when bureaucracy stops any individual from regaining their humanity, their sense of worth, their dignity, their entitlement to breathe fresh air and to go about their business and at their will. And some of the cases that I've seen are absolutely unbelievable. I don't know if anybody's ever actually gone to a cinema and watched 12 Years a Slave. I only actually got 5 minutes into that film and I had to leave the cinema. I was so emotional, I couldn't watch it. And when it comes on TV now and my husband says things like, oh, this looks like the kind of thing you'd want to watch, I cannot bear to watch it. And I can't bear to watch a film. Can you imagine that's your life? Can you imagine the kinds of things that happened back all those years ago are still going on today? We have people with special needs who are actually being kept in cupboards and put to work as agricultural workers. We have women and men who are actually kept in closed rooms and sold for sex. So God knows how many people. We have, I know that Justice in Care, they told me once about a woman who was kept naked in the cab of an articulated lorry and taken from one motorway service station to another. She didn't even have the dignity of a towel to cover her body, and she was prostituted from service station to service station and eventually fled naked. She fled naked. Can you imagine what that feels like, to wake up every day knowing that you're going to end the day in that same dreadful place as you're in now? It is absolutely inconceivable. As a politician, I feel it's my duty to work with any other politician who is prepared to change that situation. You know, I'm a big fan of Ian Duncan Smith. He knows this, but even if I'd never met Ian Duncan Smith, the fact that he has looked at this with Lord McCall and has laid down amendments and this private members bill that Lord McCall has done and this report, it tells me that they are decent human beings who will not allow politics to get in the way of justice to make sure that these human beings get everything they deserve. I worry that we are putting in barriers. You know, I've gone to actual centres where asylum seekers have been kept, and they were trafficked to this country, and the traffickers have turned up outside the hostels because that person is a commodity. That person's life is a commodity, just like buying a loaf of bread. You know, it's so degrading. And as politicians, we should not be sleeping at night if we don't try to change a system that stops that human being from having dignity and to be able to live their life. So I could say a lot about what we need to do, but I think what you need to understand is, as a politician, I will work with anyone and everyone and do all I can to make sure that any victim of modern slavery or any other kind of injustice for that matter gets my help, my support to make sure their life is returned as normal as possible, with dignity, with respect, so that they can hold their heads up high and they can walk free amongst everybody else who's only ever known freedom. So well done, Louise. Well done, Cristina. Well done, Tatiana. I just love you all, and I'm so pleased to do anything I can to help you and to work with you to achieve your goals, which are my goals.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Carolyn, and particularly for that very inspiring message of cross-party, transcending the boundaries of party politics for justice. Exactly what we are keen to do. And I know that you might have to leave at past, so I'll say thank you for now. And also hope that you'll forgive me for not wishing you a happy St. David's Day, which I should have done in my opening remarks. I'm sure I'll be told off for that later on. Cristina, you've been waiting very patiently. I'm going to turn to you now, and it'd be great to just hear from your perspective, from a frontline perspective, particularly kind of what's working and what needs to change. Absolutely.
Good afternoon, everyone. And how do I follow Carolyn after all of that amazing enthusiasm? So a number of the findings that Louise and the teams at both organizations have come up have been already identified. But one of the key area for us, or certainly for me, was the connection between the victim of this crime and the criminal justice process, in order to successfully rebuild lives and move on from being a victim of a crime, but in this particular case, human trafficking and slavery. We needed to see how best we can strengthen that bridge between the victim and the criminal justice process, the police who needs to investigate those individuals, and the police who needs to prepare the right case files and hand them over to prosecution, and then the prosecution doing the best that they can in courts. So when I met Justice and Care, I was working for the police forces, and I could see that there was a really key gap there in terms of tailored victim support when it comes to human trafficking and modern day slavery. And learning from a number of the partners and various organizations nationally, and quite a few are actually in the call today, we looked at what is that best model of operating in terms of aligning the right response, the right standards, and the right care with a very uniformed, law enforcement orientated organization. And that's how the Navigator program came to light. It was a role that is meant to provide independent advocacy, navigation, coordination, support, signposting to victims identified by the police force, in order to provide an environment where safety, accommodation, health, family is not a stress factor. It's not a urgency factor that they faced alone. They were facing those challenges with us and our partners. So for us, the Victim Navigator, when we came to light, we realized that to navigate your way successfully as a victim through not only the multiple service providers and services out there, but also through a very complex criminal justice process, was a key gap, and one that it's been met since. So that's how we tend to respond to cases in UK, alongside a law enforcement partner, alongside the police, alongside the criminal justice process, so that we stand a fair chance at both the victim getting the justice, but also the police tackling those organized criminals, and in some cases disorganized, as we quite rightly know, and actually cut out their activities, but also prevent further harm from taking place to the future generations of victims.
Thank you, Cristina, for that really interesting and helpful perspective. I can see Carolyn has gone, the division bell has rung, and we've got a few questions coming in, but I thought that I might start with one question, actually, and I don't know which of you would prefer to take this, which is to say, we work with a range of different sort of politicians across the piece on issues like this, and Carolyn is an absolute sort of gemstone in that. How do we convince more sort of UK legislators to take this issue seriously? How do we translate it into something meaningful that actually convinces them to take action? What do you see as the way forward for that?
Shall I jump in first, and then Chris, feel free to add on? I think part of it is helping people connect it to their own constituency. I think there are still some MPs who aren't aware that modern slavery is probably happening in their constituency. We know, unfortunately, that survivors don't necessarily, even when they come into the system, they don't necessarily have any contact with their MP. They might not necessarily appear in surgeries and so on for MPs. Some do if they've had help and advice, but many more probably don't. So I think that there's something, especially organisations working on the front line can do to build relationship with their own local MP. But there's something that we can also do centrally from Westminster in terms of helping more and more MPs to understand that this is probably happening in their locality. I think we also have to help people understand really what we mean by modern slavery. I think it's too easy for people to get confused with issues around smuggling, for example, or more general migrant crisis. And obviously there are some intersections between those, but it's not the same thing. It is something particular. It does involve the exploitation of people. And I think we need to sometimes help more politicians to understand that difference. In particular as well, that it can be something that British nationals experience. It's not an immigration issue, really. It can happen to anybody of any nationality in various different circumstances. And I think we have some work to do to continually remind politicians the true nature of what we're dealing with.
Cristina, I wonder if you might just pick up on the second part of that point there, because it is something that's really struck me in the past, is thinking about the proportion of British nationals who are affected by this crime. And I kind of inclined to agree with Louise that it seems like there's a way to go before politicians really grasp that. Is that something that you've seen on the ground as well? Is that borne out in the reality?
So I think the key message here is that we need to be driven by data to understand what their demand is, what sort of targets are we looking at, what sort of methods of operating we're looking at in order for us to influence any form of policy change or tactics change or guidance change. What we are seeing is two cohorts of victims when it comes to the British nationality. We have the under 18s or the young persons. Typically, we see them referred to as county lines exploitation, which really what it is urban street gangs or localized gangs who are targeting the young British population to carry out the criminal models. And then we have the adults, British nationals, which we are beginning to pay more attention to and ask different questions when we engage with potential victims of crimes. So if we're looking at say, for example, a sex worker up in Manchester, and we change the questions from this is prostitution or this is a control of prostitution if she's under someone's control to what are the circumstances of her life and her environment, what sort of control methods are applied against her, what true freedom does she actually have or freedom of choice. We very quickly begin to see that actually we're talking about something very different here. This is not straight sort of prostitution. We're talking about trafficking for sexual exploitation. So the more we change the way we engage with the British nationals, especially adults, the more we change our questions and our approaches and our engagement methods, the more we realize that this is actually a growing issue. And that then informs us to what extent, what is it, what factors it's created that level of exploitation for the individual. And often we see other issues in hand. We see substance abuse, we see extreme levels of poverty, we see zero support in terms of the networks, whether it's family or support services. We see years of going through a number of systems, whether it is the social system or the criminal justice system, where often interventions had not worked at those moments in time. So that what that means then is that the trust in what we have to offer, as far as the victims are concerned, is almost non-existent. But it also shows us how layered human trafficking is, and how the criminals have that ability to come in and target those at risk. So British nationals is a growing matter, and we're beginning to pay attention to it. So we're certainly watching and monitoring this space in order to help Louise and yourselves in terms of teams on what should those policy discussions be.
So we've got lots of questions coming in now, thick and fast. So I'm going to try and get through a few. And this is from Andrew Wallace, formerly of this parish. Andrew, thank you very much for your question. So Andrew makes the point that, you know, a lot of this discussion so far has been about sort of addressing the issues after the point at which exploitation has taken place. We know that needs to happen, but actually, you know, are we thinking enough about the drivers of modern slavery and the sort of significance of the demand for cheap goods, services, and labour, and indeed the endless supply of vulnerable people, as he puts it? So he asks, kind of strategically, how do we stop modern slavery in the first place, and are we responding proportionately given the cost to the UK economy?
I will take the first part, if that's all right. Thank you, Andrew. I knew I could always rely on you for the tough questions. Are we responding proportionately? Absolutely not. The investment into fighting this particular crime, both in the prevention sphere and in the post-exploitation sphere, is really, really low. There has been some investment, absolutely. We cannot overlook that. We have a number of specialist teams, both national, international, and localized investment. But compared to the global market of human trafficking and the revenue made, we're nowhere near investing as much. Stopping slavery, it's I now align slavery in the same conversation as climate change. This is a global effort. And this is not just about what we do after post-exploitation and how the different service providers may or may not work well in the different infrastructures. We need to look at that supply chain, the entire supply chain, from the source and as far as the demand is concerned to the supply part, whether it's sex trafficking or labor market. A number of actors are part of that journey, from investors to shareholders to consumers to the actual workforce, to legislation in countries in terms of protection of workers or in terms of criminal justice responses. We all have a part to play. So this is a global issue. And unless we approach this as a global issue where we know we cannot do this alone and that we need the right partners from all sectors, until those conversations are serious and are signed up to it and bought into investing for a better world in terms of the exploitation, the criminal exploitation of human beings, until then, we are putting plasters over the bleeding that we currently see in this particular market. That's just a short answer, Andrew.
I'm going to take the question, take the conversation back to victim support now. And Pippa comes in with a very interesting question about the importance of mental health support specifically for victims. This is something that she says is frequently overlooked, but in our experience is the cornerstone of enabling recovery. Louise, perhaps you might have some thoughts on the importance of mental health support. How do we get that aspect right?
Yeah, thanks, Joe, and thanks, Pippa for the question, and also thanks, Pippa, for the incredible work that you do, sort of filling that gap, really. And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing at the moment, is that it is charities having to fill the gap in terms of getting access for individual survivors to mental health treatment. We, of course, have to remember that mental health services in this country are stretched for everybody. And I think that's a huge factor in why there's this barrier for survivors getting access. We've all also seen the stories about the stretch that there is on mental health services. So putting idealism to one side slightly, we also have to appreciate that there are lots of other vulnerable people who need access to mental health services who are also waiting a long time and facing barriers. But I do think it needs to be much more integral to the package of support that the Home Office is offering people. And there are some particular needs that people who've experienced trauma, which is often what modern slavery survivors have experienced, need in terms of the kind of mental health support they can access. I'm pleased to know that the Home Office are actually looking at this at the moment. They did make a promise, a commitment in the command paper called the New Plan for Immigration that they published nearly a year ago now, March last year, about looking at the mental health support. And we know at the moment that they're looking into this. What they will come up with, we've yet to see, but we would like to see people having much better access. Chris will be able to talk about this more specifically, but I know it's something that we do at Justice in Care, is we help facilitate the survivors that we work with get access to counsellors who are able to help them because of the delays and the barriers that they face going through other means. So I think it needs to be something that the Home Office look at. I think in terms of, come back to something that we said in our report, is that part of the problem sometimes is that there's not as good sort of joined up working between the support provided under the Home Office funded care contract and other services, specialist services. We can't expect our support providers under the Home Office to be experts in mental health. People need access to specialist mental health services, but that means they need an open door. And unfortunately, you have to sometimes hit all sorts of other checklists of eligibility to get through. You have to contend with the waiting lists that there are and the restrictions on the available kinds of support that you have, which might not be appropriate to you as a survivor of modern slavery. What I think we need is a more bespoke approach that the Home Office can take. Unfortunately, that probably costs money, which we know is a challenge. I don't know, Chris, if you want to say a little bit about the kinds of support that Justice in Care facilitates.
Sure. So I see, when we talk about mental health, I see this in two ways. The first and foremost is for the survivors, of course, but secondly, for those providing the support to those survivors. So you don't necessarily have to, often survivors don't actually want counseling, or certainly not in the first few months of from our experience of interacting with us. So we need to be able to have that service available as and when they feel ready, and it's accessed in a language that they understand, so there is no third party present to that call. Heard quite a few horrific stories, but secondly is unlimited, because mental health is not like physical health. You cannot put a deadline of recovery period of a broken leg versus a significant trauma. But during the time of waiting to access certain support services out there that provides mental health support, we also have those individuals working with the victims. And if you are well trained in a trauma-informed approach, you could actually add much more value to that journey of recovery than we think you do. Often we have victims who present as suicidal at very different times of the night, and it's usually the support staff who respond to it. Often they may have anxiety attacks. Again, it's those workers who need to know how best to respond. So actually having mental health first aiders and the right amount of training for those workers, as well as keeping aside all the complications and the complexities around the mental health service and the NHS at the moment, having set aside funding, even if it is at an individual sort of organizational level, set aside funding for those you are supporting as part of your fundraising package, as part of your cost of looking after a survivor. And often we think of accommodation, food, basic necessities, and not always think, well, actually we would need 20 sessions, 50 sessions at £60 a session to also be included in that package when seeking out funds. So there is a way we can bypass the waiting list of the NHS and bypass some of the inadequate services out there. But equally important, we need to invest in the workforce providing that care to the survivors just as much.
We've still got some more questions coming in. Do keep those coming in. Kieran makes an interesting point here about the links between, and this was touched on earlier, I think, in your remarks, Cristina, but the links between sort of so-called county lines and modern slavery. And he says that sadly, vulnerable young people such as care leavers in particular are at risk. But if, for example, they are quote unquote forced into storing or selling drugs, they are often treated as a criminal and not a victim. And so the question being, how can we tackle this and offer these victims support alongside the preventative measures that we've just touched on? Any thoughts on the county lines? Because I can see how these two, often the media and politicians will jump to the kind of the buzzword or the jargon that's being used often, and county lines seem to get a lot of pickup recently. How is this different and how is it connected?
It really isn't any different than trafficking an adult. It is human trafficking and it is exploitation of a human being. What is different is that we're talking about children here. So there are a number of other areas that we also need to really, really pay attention to, such as the family support, the network, development matters, education, and any other statutory areas that need to wrap around these children. So as far as county lines or urban street gangs and exploitation of children, whether it's criminal, sexual or other, these individuals are trafficking these kids. You are quite right, Kieran, when you say in terms of being seen as offender, often there is a tunnel vision approach when it comes to stop and searches, for example, or certain suspicious activities, and individuals are found in certain locations. If they find criminal items on them, they will be seen first and foremost as an offender. What is changing, though, is how we view and map and understand the circumstances around the individual. So we are seeing more officers being trained in asking beyond the offending part, asking the question how and why. How did you end up in this position and why? What was the reason why you got involved with this particular side of our society? And often we see a parallel level of investigation. We see investigation against the offense that individual, albeit there is a child that's been found again to be investigated for, as well as whether they are a victim of human trafficking and they are forced into. So this changing approach is relatively new and it is spreading very fast, and I'm pleased to say that. But we still have a long way to go. And the difficulties, Kieran, with this situation is that a law has been broken. What we need to understand is whether they've been forced to break the law or whether they have chosen to break the law. And these are two very distinct approaches. And depending on the answer, that's how that criminal justice process will carry on. So early doors, I'm really hopeful that what I'm seeing out there, especially within the police forces, is promising, but we still have a long way to go. But make no mistake, it's human trafficking, whether you're an adult or a child, and it is exploitation of a human being, whether you're a child or an adult.
Louise, just so I can't be accused of not allowing you input on that question. I mean, do you agree? Do you think, is it right that we treat these things as sort of a coherent crime, as Cristina sort of put quite powerfully there, or is it something that actually we do need to disentangle, and it might make sense almost for politicians to see them as separate? Is there a risk of confusion maybe if we see these things as parts of the same issue?
I think there's certainly a risk actually that there are some politicians who will focus too much on the county lines aspect. There is a danger that we forget that there's lots of other forms of exploitation happening in this country, and we need to make sure we're putting the same kind of effort into enforcing and policing and protecting individuals in those contexts. It is complex, as Chris has said, and there are some people, some police officers, some people in the Crown Prosecution Service, who are concerned that individuals are saying they've been exploited when actually they've made a choice. That's even more difficult to disentangle when you are talking about young people, actually how much choice is there? Actually, have they been groomed, if you like, into this situation? Has it been part of a longer journey? I think it's quite a complicated situation and difficult to disentangle, really. How much even has this person chosen, even if they themselves would claim to have chosen? So I think there's a lot that we need to do to look at safeguarding when it comes particularly to young people in this circumstance. But I think it's important. I think the county lines tag is probably unhelpful because I don't think it means very much to people. I think we do need to keep naming it as criminal exploitation or exploitation for criminal purposes, or whatever phrase you want to use, but to keep making sure that we talk about it in that way when we're talking about the modern slavery aspect. But I do think we need to make sure that we balance it out. We have seen huge rise in the number of people going into the national referral mechanism, this process we have to identify victims, coming from county lines inquiries, which is great. But we need to make sure we're also making sure we put the resources into looking for and identifying victims of other kinds of exploitation as well.
I'm going to take a question now from Jasmine. Thanks very much for this, Jasmine, and I'll put it to our panelists. So, what are your thoughts on pre-NRM care and support? Jasmine says that they work for West Midlands Anti-Slavery Network's Safe Place project, which not only being a mouthful, is also a pre-NRM safe house for adult male survivors of modern slavery. So thank you so much, Jasmine, for the work you're doing. But yeah, it would be great to just touch on that pre-NRM care and support phase. I think that is often left out of the discussion on this. Chris, why don't you take that one first?
Absolutely, thank you. Yes, having the right response in that early engagement phase, especially immediately post-identification, it is crucial. We too see high level of engagement if the right environment is provided to those individuals identified. So pre-NRM places of safety, I believe that was supposed to be delivered and was supposed to be available to use as part of the new contract. Louise is going to come into that a bit more, but we're certainly seeing significant struggles in identifying places of safety pre-NRM during those first 24 hours to say anything up to 7 days, where we can take individuals where we know that they are safe, they are cared for, they have wraparound support, their needs are met, and they have the ability to spend some time in understanding what exactly is happening, what are their options, what are their choices. So hugely in favor of, not enough of them.
I'm going to go straight into the next question.
Can I just quickly come in, Joe?
No, you can't, I'm afraid. No, only joking. Of course you can. Of course you can.
Yeah, just to highlight it, that is one of the recommendations of the report, that we need more of these. And we did feature the West Midlands as an example, the safe place. But yeah, as Chris said, we need more of them. It's one of those perfect examples of people filling a gap that we have in the system, and we really need everyone to have access to that, not just the limited number of options we have at the moment.
I'm going to take a question now from Fiona, who's put this helpfully in the chat. And Fiona mentions or refers to previous mentions of modern slavery costing the economy millions, indeed billions of pounds. But quite wisely asks, how is this hitting average Britain or the average Briton directly, so that they will actually sit up and care? It's something that, as we've made the case over the years at the CSJ, and I know Justice and Care similarly, is that it is happening here. But how do we get people to care about it? Even though it should feel like everyone should care about it, what can we do to really, I guess, hammer it home that it is an issue that people should care about?
I'm not sure that comparing the modern day slavery with the traditional typical slavery that most people envision when you mention the word is quite what we want to compare what modern day slavery looks like, because modern day slavery is very subtle. So whilst you go on about your business, you don't actually realize that you come into contact with slaves, and we have to call the word for what it is. So I keep going on about the basic services that you come across in your day-to-day life. You know, your car is washed. So whilst you go on your social media apps and your car is being washed, if you just look up, you realize, you know, if you start paying attention, start asking questions, you realize it's a cash-rich business, which means that there will be tax evasion, first and foremost. There will be workers' rights breached or not applied at all. So then you have legislation that is not respected or paid into. So again, certain orders that we create in our societies are not respected. But from a more personal level, you are essentially enabling and using a slave whilst you're having a service that you're not even aware of. And that applies to a number of other services, whether it's goods such as your clothing and textile industry, whether it's electronics and other sort of components and electric parts that we have in other countries, even down to our mobile phones. If we're looking at the farming, the construction sector, the hospitality sector, everywhere we walk through in our day-to-day life, the criminals have managed to infiltrate and create a mirror effect between the community, the citizens and them and their product, which is the human being. So whether we look at the moral duty that we have to not use those services, all the way up to tax evasion and not actually contributing to our national central funds that actually fund services that we need, such as health service, for example, because they want to money launder or they want to fund a lifestyle with money that hasn't been earned well. It affects every Briton. We can try and find a figure. Of course, we can try and find a figure per every British national. How much does it cost? But it's more of that moral duty and what it does to the country in a very subtle and hidden way.
I might just say that one of the things that really struck me in the last few years that did seem to puncture the national consciousness around this area was the character in Line of Duty. And some in the audience might recall, who I think had a learning disability and had been cuckooed. And the issue of cuckooing as a sort of expression of modern slavery seems to have been something that's brought this issue home to people. I don't know, perhaps Louise, you might want to comment on cuckooing as a particular expression of modern slavery and what can be done to address that particular part of it.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. This cocooning is again a fairly recently identified sort of form of modern slavery, if you like. I think a little bit again because it's connected with drugs and drug dealing. That for a long time it was just seen as a drugs problem, but we are now beginning to understand it more as actually a form of exploitation. So, just for those who aren't aware, cuckooing is the term given when someone's home is taken over and used against their will or under threat or coercion by usually drug gangs for storing and dealing drugs. But this person has no control. So hence it's like the cuckoo in the nest. These people are in their own home, but their home has been taken over. And often they're very much in fear, and sometimes they experience violence and so on at the hands of those who've taken over their home. And this is something actually that we looked into last year and did a very short paper on, because it's something that our navigators at Justice in Care and other colleagues on the frontline, police officers and people in other organisations had brought to our attention, which is that they were now understanding this as exploitation, but when they came to a situation of looking to apply criminal charges, they were finding that actually, according to prosecutors, it doesn't fit under the Modern Slavery Act. So we seem to have a bit of a problem in terms of the law that can be used to charge those who are pursuing this form of exploitation in particular. So we think in that case, if it doesn't fit, and the Crown Prosecution Service have said it doesn't fit under the Modern Slavery Act, then we think that's a gap in the law that we should be looking to close. And we're really hoping that the government said they will look at it, although we're not sure we've quite convinced them yet. So we will see. But I think it's, as with county lines, I think this is something where awareness is going to grow about this form of exploitation. And I think, again, because it's happening absolutely behind closed doors in people's own homes, it's taken a while to fully come to understand it. But just maybe quickly to also bring us back to where we started in terms of victim support, obviously there's so many implications for this individual, like their home has now become a place of exploitation. So what happens? We identify it, we identify them, we see what's happening, but then do we need to move them to another place of safety? So you have lots of challenges there in terms of making sure that person is able to be supported and have a home that is safe and protected.
I'm going to combine two questions now, and I'll just give a final call for any further or final questions from people as we move to the final minutes of this. I think it's been really, really interesting. And we've had two questions about the Nationality and Borders Bill. We know this is currently working its way through the Houses. And one question notes that sort of in light of Part 5 of the Nationality and Borders Bill, is the government listening to the experts about modern slavery who are consistently saying, if passed, will have a catastrophic sort of effect for victims of modern slavery? And if they're not listening, why not? And then the other question says, do you have any particular pressing concerns about the Nationality and Borders Bill? So this is clearly coming through as an area where audience members have concerns. What do we see as the main challenges there, as well as the opportunities, if any? That's the optimist in me shining through as ever. Cristina, why don't you come in first on that? Any thoughts on the bill?
Wow, I think you want to go to Louise first, and I'm going to let Louise lead on this. I am still a student of the bill, and I often have to have those sessions with Louise. But what I will say is that there is an enormous amount of effort, and it's probably the only act or bill that I have seen in the recent years where it receives such mixed responses, but certainly such a coordinated effort from all of our partners and stakeholders in the sector. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm going to hand over this to Louise.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so Part 5 of the Nationality and Borders Bill is the part that has specific provisions around modern slavery in it. There are a number of things that are concerning about some of those provisions. It seems likely that some of those provisions will make it more difficult to identify victims of modern slavery and enable them to be referred in to receive support and help. It seems to be creating some barriers to that. So there are provisions that mean you have a time period in which you have to disclose that you've been a victim if you're someone in the immigration system. And if you miss that time window, then you may not be able to enter support. There's also provisions around excluding some people from receiving support if they have certain kinds of criminal history, which seems to be a fairly wide net rather than the more targeted approach that might be more appropriate. Whether the government is listening to experts, I think it's difficult to know. The government hasn't adopted itself or accepted any recommendations for amending the bill that have been proposed so far. On that score, I think the government is juggling this question of immigration and how they control immigration with modern slavery, and those of us on the modern slavery side of things may feel that they've drawn that in the wrong place, and I don't think we've convinced the government of that at this point in time, but we will see. It hasn't finished yet. Trying to be an optimist as well, Joe. There are some opportunities. Carolyn Harris actually did mention them. So the other clauses that are in this modern slavery section of the bill do relate to support for victims. They're not perfect. We would like the government to slightly modify them. In particular, we'd like to see the government offer in the bill support for people after they've been through this identification process and have been formally confirmed as a victim. And that's not in the bill at all at the moment. And Carolyn mentioned amendments from Ian Duncan-Smith and Lord McCall. Ian Duncan-Smith had one in the Commons. Lord McCall has a similar one in the House of Lords, which is coming up for debate in the next week. And we very much hope that the government will will adopt that amendment to have support and temporary leave to remain during that period for those who don't currently have residency, for a period of 12 months after someone's been formally identified. So we're hopeful. The government did make some concessions in the House of Commons. They made a commitment to offer support for 12 months after someone's confirmed as a victim, but they didn't say they would put it in the bill. So it may be a small step in the right direction, but we will see what happens. I think there's a lot more that we have to do to help make sure that we address some of these concerns around the immigration system and how we make sure that we're approaching this through the right lens. Because first and foremost, slavery is a crime. It's not an immigration matter, and we need to make sure that we keep saying that really loudly and strongly, and helping everyone involved to see the evidence of that.
Well, thanks so much, Louise and Cristina, for that incredibly helpful discussion. That feels like a nice call to action on which to bring this webinar to a close. I think it's fair to say that the report is always just the first step, as I say. It's the thing that gets you into the conversation. We'll certainly keep having that conversation with parliamentarians and trying to use that bill as much as possible to deliver that new vision for victim support. But certainly the fight isn't over at all. I look forward to continuing to engage with people who've joined us. Thank you so much to our audience for their excellent questions. They've been very thought-provoking, and they've opened up a lot of the sort of difficult issues in this debate. For those who do want to continue the conversation online, please feel free to use the Modern Slavery hashtag on Twitter. You can find the report on both the CSJ and Justice and Care's websites, and encourage you to go and have a look at that. And do follow both accounts on Twitter as well if you'd like to continue to be updated on the bill and the conversation relating to this important subject. But that's it. I'm going to say a final thanks and a good evening to you all. Thank you.